Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting us to Art Basel to discuss new biennials in the Americas. And while we plan to talk about a couple of individual biennials, the purpose also of our conversation is to sort of like address the question of biennial fatigue or biennial exhaustion. And as many of you know, next year there's going to be this entire marathon of biennials, triennials in Venice, Documenta, Münster, and so on. But maybe this is also something that we now sort of experience a little bit with the art fairs here, the form of exhaustion. Also, it's a sort of ever more crowded field of art festivals and art fairs and other type of art festivals. I think that the biennials, particularly in the 1990s, had a really important role in sort of like either bringing art to places in the world where there were not necessarily the infrastructure to see contemporary art in museums or art education or through magazines. And on the other hand, of course, also bringing art from the so-called periphery to the center. And sort of like then the biennial became or was understood as this ultimate format for the globalized age and sort of broke through the barrier of a canon that was mostly dominated by Northern American or Western European art. So in a certain way, I felt like that over the last couple of years, really since the 1990s, the biennials have become more and more sort of like these showcases, overview exhibitions that always showed the latest and hottest trends of what was going on around the world. And in some way, because of the proliferation of art fairs, this has also changed quite dramatically. It's much easier to discover younger artists going to an art fair, I feel, now than doing that at a biennial. And obviously there's very big differences between biennials and art fairs, but as you can see, art fairs also have curated programs, art fairs also have talks and so on. So what we wanted to discuss today was to see like what are alternatives for biennials or triennials to not only be these overview shows, and how can they connect but perhaps more to the specificities, the particularities of the places that that they take place in. And I mentioned this also as an interest of mine, particularly having curated a number of international biennials and also being now the co-artistic director of Front International, a triennial that will take place in Cleveland in 2018 that I'm co-organizing with Michelle Grabner, who also co-curated the last Whitney Biennial. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. And so here to my right, Rocío Aranda-Alvarado. She is a curator at the Museo del Barrio and was also on the curatorial team together with Pablo, León de la Barra for Site Santa Fe, and is also working at the moment at the Biennial for El Museo del Barrio, which is taking place in 2017. I already introduced or mentioned Pablo. Pablo is the curator for Latin American art at the Salon Guggenheim Museum in New York. And as I said, he was one of the co-curators of the Site Santa Fe Biennial as well, which was titled Much Wider Than a Line. And just recently also been appointed the curator of the Mexican Pavilion at the Venice Biennial, where he's going to work with the Mexican artist Carlos A. Morales. Next to Pablo, we have Ngahiraka Mason. She is the curator of the first Honolulu Biennial, which is scheduled to open in March of next year. And she was formerly the indigenous curator at the Auckland Art Gallery in Auckland, New Zealand, which is the oldest museum in New Zealand. And last but not least, Trevor Schoonmaker, who is artistic director of Prospect 4, which is taking place in November 2017, and he's also the chief curator of contemporary art at the Nasher Museum at Duke University. So my question really is, is there really such a thing as biennial fatigue? And if there really is, how can we sort of like formulate new ideas for biennials? Trevor and I, we had a little conversation before we went on stage and saying, like, sort of how do you integrate international art into a local context? And I remember, for example, when we did the Istanbul Biennial, that pretty much every artist that we met when I was in Istanbul said, oh, I was already in the Istanbul Biennial number 8, or I was in 7. And so like this local pool shrinks as longer as these biennials are there. And we were talking a little bit about this. And I don't know if you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on this relationship between the local and the global.
Sure. I'm curating Prospect New Orleans, and so I've been spending a lot of time in New Orleans. And I think, New Orleans has a very vibrant visual arts community, but it's not a huge visual arts community. This is Prospect 4, and you try not to go back to the same well. And so while it's growing exponentially, it is difficult, like to find, not just to find artists of quality, but to find artists of quality that fit the vision that you're trying to, bring to the fore in your triennial. So finding the right match as the pool continues to shrink, and that, over time in terms of looking at historical artists and artists who may be now in their 50s and 60s and sort of mid-career or late career, but there's so many young artists that I'm meeting now that are really interesting, and but it's definitely a challenge. I think it's one of the things of managing the expectations for a young biennial or a young triennial and how it engages with the community. One of the things that I deal with all the time, and I'd love to hear with you all, is that most of my time in New Orleans is community relationship building and not, quote unquote, curatorial work and studio visits. And most of it is really trying to get and develop and build good relationships and support in the community, so that if New Orleans doesn't support it, so outside of Prospect 4, so that continues to Prospect 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and can thrive down the road. But I'd love to hear from you all what that experience has been like.
Well, let me just ask you one question before we move on. Prospect was sort of like born out of an idea that sort of like was about revitalizing New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and then Cameron brought a lot of energy into the city to make this happen. And I wonder, like, after many years since that happened, and what are your ideas to sort of integrate art in the city, and what is sort of like some of the starting off points for you in thinking about this?
Well, it's changed a lot, of course, since 2008 in the first Prospect, which was only a couple years after Katrina. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. So a lot has changed. I mean, first of all, the city has really come back in a really positive way. The development there is so, if any of you went to Prospect 1, there is amazing use of sort of reimagining spaces that had been, they were like, homes were obliterated and wiped off the map, and artists engaging with those empty spaces and vacant buildings. Those empty spaces, vacant buildings aren't really there in the same way. So like the whole idea of Prospect has to change. So you're working with more established venues, or even like the transit authority. It's just finding new inventive ways to not. So first of all, I should say Prospect has no home base. There's no, if you go to Venice, there's no Arsenale, there's no Italian Pavilion, there's no bricks and mortar for the organization, so it's all collaborations. So the last Prospect 3 that Franklin Sermons curated, there were 18 venues and sites around the city. We'll have approximately 20-ish, but it's all generating these partnerships. It's all collaboration and partnership. And the other thing that happens is as you go further into a new biennial or triennial, the community gets more and more excited, the artistic community, and they very understandably want to put their best foot forward and present their own work. So some places that might have been collaborators at one point, that space is no longer available. And that's great, because then people are coming down and they're seeing what's happening on the ground. There are amazing projects that were going on that weren't technically under the roof of what Franklin curated in Prospect 3, but were incredible things that people saw.
Rocío and Pablo both were co-curators for Sightlines in 2016. Is it still running?
Yeah. Until
I was lucky
January 7 or 8, so you still have time to go and see it.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to come for the opening, and it's true. If you guys have the chance to go to Santa Fe, I would highly recommend it. It was really a biennial that gave me sort of the hope back that biennials really can still contribute significantly to the discourse around art. And what I thought was particularly interesting, and maybe you guys can talk a bit about this, it's not like that it is one biennial. It's actually a biennial in 3 parts, or 3 biennials form one framework.
Do you want to talk about it?
I'll just say what the idea with sort of bringing or doing a makeover maybe for the biennial in Santa Fe was to think about a hemispheric exploration. And so ours is the second version. The first one was 2 years ago, and there'll be another one in 2 years. And then I think the idea is to consider keeping it a biennial of the Americas.
Yeah, so, I mean, the biennial has been existing already for 20 or something years. Maybe the first international biennial of the United States. And it had reached that point that you call biennial fatigue. And under the leadership of Site Santa Fe's super dynamic director, Irene Hoffmann, who's here in the public sitting down, she paused the biennial for a season, so it didn't happen in 2 years, to really rethink what a biennial in Santa Fe could be. You know, I mean, if it was going to continue being the kind of international curator with a big name flying over and bringing his group of international artists to be shown in the biennial, which originally had been working. It really had like the best curators. Robert Storr had done one of the Biennale, Rosa Martinez. So really kind of at the beginning of the Biennale, it was really kind of an important Biennale. But then when biennial started happening everywhere, and you have one biennial opening every 2 weeks somewhere, it kind of lost its force, you know. And Irene really thought, okay, how do we reconnect with the Santa Fe itself, with the idea of doing a biennial? And she invited different curators to give their thoughts about how could you change this relationship. And here's where the idea of doing sidelines 1, 2, and 3 came. We did, Rocío said, we did number 2. The first one was curated partly in-house by Irene, the curator, Janet Dis, curator at Site Santa Fe at the time, Irene, Candice Hopkins, who's now part of the documentary team, and Lucia San Roman from Tijuana in Mexico. So they did an incredible job that we actually were able to see before we started curating ours. So in a way, we also kind of connected to what was already developed. And Irene had the idea of changing it into kind of a hemispheric biennial, connecting the continent north to south. And she invited 5 co-curators, so imagine 5 people doing a biennial, so that's already a challenge. Rocío Alvarado from el Museo del Barrio, originally from Chile, but living in New York. Pip Day from Canada and the UK, who used to live in Mexico for a long time and now is living in Montreal, where she runs an art center. Kiki Mazzucchelli from Sao Paulo, but based in London.
Kathleen Ash Milby, who's curator at the Smithsonian Institution Native American Museum of the American Indian. And
none of the curators knew each other except me, that I knew Kiki, Rocío, and Pip, but the others didn't know each other. So it was really, okay, how do you put 5 people to work together and do something coherent in a period of about 1 year, no? And on the other hand, having 5 people doing it, it kind of took off the responsibility of one having to be the main figure curator representing everything, and really allowed each one to explore in a small scale the ideas that we wanted to work together.
Yeah, it was one of the first meetings we had was to come with ideas of artists that we were interested in working with. And what was great is that already there were some coincidences and some curators had picked the same artist, so that was wonderful. And I also wanted to say that we had a great base with which to start. I thought the first sightlines that Irene and Janet co-curated was excellent in the way that it excavated the significance of the land itself, the site, as a symbolic but also real historic space that was very complicated with 400 years of colonial and post-colonial history. And so that, I think, helped us to think about what we wanted to say to sort of further that, right?
Santa Fe is a very complex place. I mean, it used to be an indigenous native land. It was then occupied by the Spanish as part of the Spanish colony. It was then Mexico. We want to make Mexico great again and have a and get a New Mexico back. And of course, later, 150 years ago, it became the United States. So all these layers, which are also present in the rest of the continent, are very obviously present there, no? And you have to deal with this, no? So I guess that was also part of the challenge that had already started to being developed in the first biennial, and that we kind of continued, but moving from the idea of the territory to the idea more of the people, no, and the knowledge that people carry in some way. No?
Yeah, the indigenous knowledge was one of the main themes that we wanted to address. We thought it was important, and I think that's evident in a lot of the artists that we selected and the kind of projects that they do that draw on a lot of traditional ways of art making and traditional ways of thinking about art and the landscape and humanity's role within that.
One important thing is that we each one had one artist who we invited to go to Santa Fe and be there in residence and develop work there. So, for example, Kiki and I, we invited Jonatas Andrade and then Victor Costales from Ecuador with his partner Julia Rometti. You had...
I had William Cordova came and did an installation, but also Francisca Benitez came and worked with the Santa Fe School for the Blind.
So there was already a previous engagement happening previous to the Biennial in kind of preparing. And then the other thing was really how to connect with the local community and the local people. And I think we did this in different ways. One, we found we were kind of looking for artists, but more than artists, we did work with Miguel.
Miguel
Gander, an amazing photographer. But we found two incredible figures that kind of, in a way, became guidelines for the Biennial. One, Paolo Soleri, the Italian architect, now dead, but who worked in Arizona building Arcosanti, this utopic city, but who had, before doing Arcosanti, had built an amphitheater in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is now closed, and it's contested land, and it's under threat of demolition. And the amphitheater, in a way, became a symbol of many of the issues that we were dealing with. You know?
Yeah, the amphitheater really opens the exhibition because it's a symbol of a larger forum that creates a space where conversations happen across generations and across locations.
What I thought was interesting was really that you could feel like this multi-layered and complicated history of Santa Fe and New Mexico, but that the curators managed to sort of like transcend from that and go really covering the entire American continent all the way from like Alaska down to the tip of South America. In your case, with the Honolulu Biennial, you also like cover a region. You're also looking at a specific location, which is sort of like the Pacific, and then particularly also the South Pacific. And you lived for a long time in New Zealand and relocated to Honolulu to do this biennial. So I was wondering, this is really a part of the world, I think, that is like the least explored. You know, I don't think of any curator who has done research in the South Pacific. So I'm curious to see, like, what is your approach to it? How do you integrate also the Hawaiian culture, which obviously has been there for a long, long time? And
aloha, Jens, and thank you for the invitation. I should say that to your original question about biennial fatigue is that perhaps a focus could be steered toward lessening the fatigue that the biennial world might feel and sharing that world with other places and other geographies. There's a strong hand, perhaps, in the way that biennials are perceived and by the originators of biennials. So that's just a comment, an observation. However, a correction on, I did move to Hawaii to Honolulu specifically 18 months ago, but not to curate the exhibition that came after I arrived in Honolulu. But it's an invitation that I was very humbled to accept. So to the idea, just extending a bit on the idea of geographies, I do believe that there is power in geography, and the views of islanders are unlike the views of people from a continent. And I'm sure, just to go to your comment on the least explored places, I don't think that Cook and Magellan might have, they did perceive the world as theirs, and we've had to wear that idea of exploring and as if we don't know ourselves, or can speak to that or express that differently. And I think this is what Honolulu Biennial can punch above the ideas of what an island country, who's technically part of America, might be able to present. So it's not so much an outward-looking position that the Biennial is coming from, more expressing what the islands, how they perceive themselves, how artists are working, their relationships outside of island life. And island life is a big life. I don't mean some isolated place on the planet. I mean a very dynamic and self-understanding system of relationships. And, relationships are everything, really. They matter the most. Relationships, I think, from an islander perspective, are the only thing that connects you, as the ocean connects us, and an influence on the thinking of the curatorial director, Fumio Nanjo, has been around the philosophy of a Tongan scholar who reinforces the fact, actually, that the oceans are our highways. They connect us. So we don't believe that we're separate. We believe we're completely connected to each other through our histories, the histories we're still creating. Things are continuous. That we don't consider ourselves separate from our environment. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and to mention some things about geography. Place does matter. We're shaped by our place. Every day we wake up differently. I wake up differently than I woke up in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the things I might choose to do, the things I might look at are so different that I was even amazed by that one, geographical and environmental fact. So I think islands have a lot to offer.
One interesting thing for me also with Honolulu or with Hawaii is also the distance that it has from, a larger landmass. And Honolulu is not necessarily a place where the audience gets to see a lot of contemporary art. In Santa Fe, you have a number of museums and possibilities to see contemporary art. Even New Orleans has a number of museums where that is possible. And I sort of wonder if the Biennial was also sort of like a means of bringing art to a place that otherwise perhaps doesn't have the opportunities to offer the audiences art from other places.
Definitely, of course, this is the nature of a biennial. But I think that something that's not well understood is that it also offers the world an opportunity to engage in the art of that place. And I know that happens. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. But this is an environment where contemporary art is measured. The environment that I'm in is an environment that measures itself not necessarily by what the rest of the world is doing. So its priority is different as a community. Of course, you know, the world is much smaller and it's quickly, you know, apparent. But when you speak about fatigue, then I would ask, well, perhaps the gaze is the position of looking is also part of the fatigue. So it's not the fatigue that we feel as curators and directors going around the world and wondering which new talent we will find and who we will re-show and this kind of thing. I think we perhaps could let that fatigue in a physical sense and a mental sense go and approach it from a different position. I've heard so many discussions during these sessions about models and so on and so forth. You know, I think if you keep asking the same question, you'll get the same answer. So we really do need to change the paradigm that we're wanting to operate in. And if it's a different paradigm, then we have to change the paradigm. Yeah?
No, I mean, the first reaction that I had when I heard that there was a biennial taking place in Honolulu was really like thinking about the location of Hawaii and the relationships that can be made from there into regions that are maybe, you know, not so on the map of sort of like the global art world, and so that was particularly interesting. Pablo mentioned this idea that there's like a biennial almost opening every other week or every 3 weeks or at least every month somewhere around the world. And I don't know, perhaps this fatigue or exhaustion is also something that we as professionals feel much more than the audiences in those places that do not travel, do not go to all of those biennials. And I just wanted to maybe each of you talk a little bit about like what are the audiences that you're trying to address, what you want the audience to sort of take away from these particular exhibitions that you are planning or have worked on.
Well, maybe I could mention just briefly that my institution, El Museo del Barrio, also has a biennial. And so I think one of the ways that you could reposition the biennial is to give it I think of it as a purpose-centered biennial, and it addresses an invisibility of the participation of Latino artists based in the New York City region in other large biennials in New York. There's 6 or more periodic exhibitions that happen at regular institutions in New York City. And, you know, we found that first younger artists of Latino heritage were not having the opportunity to show at El Museo originally. There was a historic kind of programming, and there wasn't a regular program of contemporary art exhibitions. And so that was the initial sort of reason for creating the biennial. But then it became almost like a political gesture of having a space where Latino artists could participate regularly in a show that was focused on contemporary art and looking at their work, not necessarily from a culturally specific perspective at all, but just to see what artists were doing and how they're contributing to contemporary American art.
I think one thing we tried to do in Santa Fe, we also had some images, maybe you can try to...
Probably the green one.
Maybe you can pass some just as I talk so people can see some stuff. But really to find artists and works that would resonate within Santa Fe and would create kind of echoes and dialogues with people working in Santa Fe, with issues that were happening in Santa Fe. So again, the issue of indigenous knowledge, dealing with indigenous traditions, folklore, the handmade, they were very present. So I think we were very interested in showing the local people that were doing similar things or confronting similar situations to the ones they were facing, but also answering them in a different way, you know? So bringing this kind of different knowledge into context. The other thing which I think is really important was the scale of the exhibition. I mean, really, Site Santa Fe is not a huge biennial. We had about 30-something artists. So really something that was very manageable, that you can digest and really understand what we as curators, but also what the artists are trying to do, but also create as a visitor the connections between the different works and allow them to resonate with each other, you know? So I think in a way we're also facing the kind of the post-mega biennial period, no? In which, of course, there's still like Venice or Sao Paulo and a few others, which are the biennials of 100 artists and 120 artists, and where the public really needs to digest. But I think there's a possibility of having these smaller biennials where you can really create much more intimate dialogues. Intimacy was a word that Hans Ulrich, when he visited Site Santa Fe, our biennial, talked about the need and the urgency for an intimate biennial. And I think that that's something that was achieved because of the scale of the place, us being 5 and really each one working very closely to each of the 5 to 8 artists we were each working. And that really allowed us to create this sense of intimacy, but transmission of knowledge from the artworks and from the artists to the public. I was in Cuenca in Ecuador this weekend, which is another biennial which has been existing for 13 years. And I mean, maybe I was one of the few foreign people visiting. And again, this sense of intimacy was very present. You know, a biennial, this time it was curated by Dan Cameron, about 30 artists. It did open 6 weeks late because it was not ready when it had to open. But still, I mean, the sense of pleasure of walking through the city and going and visiting the different places where the art is happening, and again the scale of it made it really pleasurable. And you're thinking while you're walking, and you're thinking while you're seeing the art. No, and it's the second time I go there, and for me that was really kind of fulfilling as a kind of a visitor, you know. So I think that's something that as public you appreciate, but also as a curator, you know. The thing, I mean, when you are invited as a curator to do a biennial, normally you're invited when the other biennial is already finishing, you know. So in reality you have a year and a half to put something together, which in reality is also a year, because then the works have to be ready. And I guess that's also part of the things that's maybe not working with the model, no? With the model as it is, you know. I mean, for me, doing a biennial, I would really need to prepare for 3 years. I mean, it's doing like a PhD thesis, you know, and bringing things together and ideas. So rethinking how to change this to produce things that are meaningful, I think is part of a way of how to rethink the idea of the biennial today, no?
I would agree with that. I think the switch in the way that we expect biennials and triennials to behave in a global sense is to create more biennials. I'm an absolute advocate of more biennials, not less. We need more voices, not less perspectives, and it shouldn't be professionals or curators that can organise these things. I think community is certainly strong, and you know, there should be advocacy, from my perspective anyway, to extend and not reduce thinking, because it's our thinking that limits what we can do, I believe. And so I think the inclusion of Indigenous in mainstream biennials and triennials is, you know, is an issue for discussion, and then it's not, because Indigenous people are doing these things anyway. So the perception is we don't need to be curated into anyone's events. We can do that for ourselves. Thank you. All the same, for instance, Greg Hill at the Museum of Canada has produced a first quinquennial program that is, you know, is a wonderful opportunity for discussion, but because it's an Indigenous quinquennial, but there's been a lot of silence around that as a discussion about that new entry into the biennial field that is, you know, either recognised or not. But it doesn't matter, is what I'm saying. We do and should have more playing in the field than we have. That's my thoughts.
Well, in the U.S. for a long time, most biennials were growing out of institutions, whether that's the Whitney Biennial, the Carnegie International, even Site Santa Fe, of course, based within the Art Center Santa Fe.
There it was the inverse. The biennial started, and then it became a place or an institution.
So when I heard that Prospect was taking place in New Orleans, I was thinking like New Orleans is really one of the few cities where a biennial could actually really take off that is not associated with an institution just simply because of the attractiveness of New Orleans as a city. I felt like, you know, I like to go to Venice, it's a beautiful place. I like to go to New Orleans. So it's also my question to you is sort of like how much like does tourism, for example, play a role in the setup of exhibitions like this, and in particularly in a place like New Orleans?
Well, it was the impetus for founding to helping revitalize New Orleans and the economy of New Orleans and bring in visitors to help in that effort post-Katrina. That was the reason why Dan Cameron and others helped actually found Prospect originally. It wasn't a civic initiative. The city didn't put forth the initiative. So there wasn't city funding, for example. But the location, you're right. I mean, New Orleans is a special place, so it's an easy draw, and it's not just a beautiful place, but it's such a culturally unique place. It's the most European city in the United States. It's the most African city in the United States. And it's deeply Southern and Southern American at the same time. And there's all these cross currents there, and this cross fertilization has created this unbelievably special culture, which you can see in the food, you can see in the music, you can see in the architecture, and it's all around you in New Orleans. And so I think what Dan Cameron did, what Franklin Sermons did, what I'm doing is really, New Orleans is the inspiration. So speaking of site and locality is critical. It happens that 2018 is the tricentennial celebration of the founding of New Orleans, or at least when the French colonized and founded the city. And so there's a lot more focus on it. So I'm taking, while Prospect has historically been, and still is, an international global triennial. Now, it was originally biennial when it was founded. And it always has had a strong focus, but connection between the local, the national, and the global. I'm focusing a little bit more on why New Orleans is where it is, at the mouth of the Mississippi, perched on the Gulf of Mexico, and the connections through water, primarily, to North America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean, Africa, and Europe. So most of the artists are, not exclusively, but most of them are from those regions. Most of them are dealing with issues ranging from, anyway, but having that focus itself, some are responding specifically to New Orleans and making work around that connection, but most are finding synergies between and parallel stories and histories between whatever part of the world they live in and the connection to New Orleans. So a little bit of research on New Orleans history has been quite helpful, and we've brought a lot of artists into New Orleans through the spring and summer and a little bit this fall to have a look, take them around and sort of immerse them a little bit, and then send them back to, some of them are new commissions, some of them are creating works in their studios, but that engagement with the city itself is really important for Prospect.
I think that in many cases with biennials in the 1990s, or maybe till like 5, 6, 7 years ago, was this idea that Pablo also mentioned, that sort of biennials come in like a UFO, they drop down, then they disappear without really leaving any trace. And it seems like, listening to what you have all been saying, is that there's a much stronger engagement now with the context, with the history, and in each case it's a very complex and contested history, whether that is Hawaii, New Orleans, or also Santa Fe. So I think it's time to sort of maybe open up the panel and see if there's any questions from the audience.
Hi. So this idea about long-term engagement, it seems like a lot of biennials are trying to do this, like Maria Lynn with Guangzhou, about leaving something that's going to stay and educating the people that are there, about not bringing in people from outside and having them do things on their own. I'm trying to struggle to see like evidence of this. Like, for everyone, it seems like we all want this, but has anyone been able to do it yet? And if so, who and how?
One of the really great examples, and one of sort of like my heroes in terms of like doing something like this, is the Liverpool Biennial, that appointed one artistic director who constantly works on the exhibition and then appoints guest curators for each of the different iterations. And that's, again, a completely new model that I thought was extremely successful, to sort of like create a continuation, but then bring in guest curators for each edition to work with the situation there, because you actually have an artistic director that has really roots within the community of Liverpool and really knows the lay of the land.
I was going to say that I think that's why Irene and Site Santa Fe were so important also, because one of the things we did as kind of our training and preparation was we visited with a lot of local groups and other smaller institutions, a lot of artists, and that's why an artist like Miguel Gendert is a really good example of how you can retain a kind of connection to the local community. You know, this was a photographer who had been working already for 40 years in the area, and so we were able to feature him as one of the artists in the exhibition, looking at images of Albuquerque and Santa Fe from the late 1970s and the early 1980s. I think that's another really important thing, and that comes from the direction of the leadership.
Yeah, the idea that you have a sort of trilogy of biennials that together really form one larger argument, I think was very compelling. Any other questions? There's one question over there. I think there's a microphone.
Yes. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for your presentations. I wonder how we might be able to reimagine biennials as sites if the notion of site itself is not excavated in light of the various art historical and museological genealogies of each and every one of these distinct locations. If the site remains, at the end of the day, at most a series of interconnected site-specific installations or a series of gallery-based exhibitions, how might we possibly change the face of the kinds of experiences, the kinds of artistic sensorium that will keep on replicating itself because the site remains, again, gallery-based or at most site-specific, but under the form of installations, which has become the kind of global modus operandi of artistic production. So I think it begs, I think rethinking biennial models begs looking at other art historical and museological genealogies. So if this makes any sense, I wonder how we might be thinking about presenting artistic practices in Honolulu in ways that are not simply based on the idea of bringing art to the people. What are the artistic practices already existent in Honolulu that may prompt the ways in which those artistic productions of the Biennale not so much bring something to the people, but make the connection between what is already there and what may be brought or co-elaborated. And I will stop.
I think, gosh, I shouldn't overthink. But I'm going to say that I think that maybe what could be helpful is a shift, a philosophical shift in how we consider what we do. And so if we're working to, for instance, the way that I'm currently working is to recognize the power of geography. Now, I'm not limiting my thinking on the power of geography to Hawaiian culture, to Pacific culture, to Polynesia, to the impact of colonization. No, I'm not doing that. How I'm thinking is we're in a time of an openness for more interpretation, not a direct one style. It's actually epistemology. So I'm interested in hermeneutics. I like ideas that epistemologies are specific to a place, and we need to understand that more rather than to keep putting up models that walk us. It's a dance. We're in a really diverse range of dances, but philosophically it can't go too many more places. And so my interest is at that level of engagement, like philosophically, what are we doing? Is this something that we want to continue? Oh, we all want something different, but how can we go to that place of difference? And art will always be produced. It's our thinking about what it is, how it behaves, and where is the genesis of that thinking, of that place. So I know I'm not directly answering your inquiry, but I think we need a substantial move in the way that we think about things, and rather than pat each other on the back. Everyone does such a wonderful job, but I think if we really mean to inquire more into what this thing is that we are engaged with and how we can create meaning, it's a dirty word, but I'm saying it, we need more meaning. What's stopping us from going to meaning? We're stopping ourselves, in my view.
No, Trevor, do you have any response to this? Because obviously your project is very sort of site-specific installations throughout the city, and how do these site-specific installations maybe also relate to the sites where they actually take place?
Well, yeah, I mean, Claire knows New Orleans better than I do. But there are so many ways, as you know, Claire, that the artists who come who can engage with the city and the cultural practices of the city. So without giving too much away, I mean, really trying to embrace those things and educate first myself, but also the artists on many of those things that make the city unique itself. There's the brass band culture, there's the Mardi Gras Indian culture, there's second lines, there's jazz, there's so many different art forms there to engage with specifically that are so unique to New Orleans. So I think if all of the artists engage with them, it would be overkill. But I think to ignore it would really be a huge mistake, and to have artists who can really thoughtfully figure out how to find some interconnectivity and collaborating with people on the ground. And I think it's part of it, collaborating with people in New Orleans. And that can be via research, that can be via performance, that can be via a lot of different ways. But it's a great question, Claire. I mean, it's like I don't know how to rethink the whole structure, and when you're hired to oh my God, I got to pull together an artist list, and I'm still trying to struggle to pull the venues together, and to rethink the whole framework is I don't have the bandwidth to even go there. But it's important. But you do want to try and mix things up and not just come with a formulaic approach. And we are trying some new things. I think that one of the advantages Prospect has is that it's all relationships, it's all collaborations, everything we do, and so it's always going to be shifting. It's never going to fall into a box in that way. So there are the aspects that are in the White Cube, in the museum, and the gallery. There are the components that are site-specific installations. They are the elements that are engaging directly with the cultural institution that is outside of the art world.
I think that what we're discussing has also to do a little bit with sort of a shift within curating that became more and more self-reflexive, where, as curators, we began to sort of mine our own history, think more about the history of exhibitions and various exhibition typologies. And I sometimes feel like sometimes it goes even too far. I'm just thinking sort of like, for example, about the São Paulo Biennial that Ivo Mesquita and Ana Paula Cohen curated, where they basically left the entire pavilion empty to sort of like demonstrate that, you know, biennials had reached a point where there needed to be sort of like a stop. Or, you know, Bergen Assembly is another sort of one where the public forum discussions, debates were privileged over making exhibitions. The last Moscow Biennial did something similar. No exhibitions, public programs really to the front, and or even the Cyprios Manifesta that ultimately didn't happen. That was supposed to be not an exhibition but a school. So there have been like these extreme examples as well, and yeah, I think we are out of time. Can we have one more question? I think there's some urgent question. There's one more urgent question there.
I come from a place in Queensland, literally on the other side of the planet. And while I really respond to that idea of a biennale that responds to a regional context, especially in your case about the ocean connections, I think there's also merit in just the. I wouldn't necessarily decry the notion of the UFO effectively, the artist, but do it in a really intelligent and interesting way that is going to kind of bring a kind of work that would never be seen otherwise. And so as a curator, I've definitely worked in a regional context, but I think that being smart about making those because artists are in global conversations now, truly. You know, the city that I'm in is a virtual replica of Miami, so just because we're on the other side of the world, artists that are here, you know, and also artists from Honolulu have a conversation with our community. So, yeah, just keeping that in mind.
Yeah, I would agree in that I think a lot of the work is done in the selection of the artists. So if you thoughtfully choose the artists who you feel like can pull and tease these things out and have the sort of thoughtful understanding in their approach and based on what they've done before and their capacity to embrace the history, the locality, the geography, then they do the work for you. But the artist selection plays a huge role. Yeah.
Well, if there's no other questions, then I thank you all for coming, and thanks to our panelists for agreeing to participate in this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jens Hoffmann.